Okay, it looks like folks have managed to get in. We'll get started. On behalf of George Mason University's program in Russian and Eurasian Studies in our College of Humanities and Social Sciences, and with my colleagues here from George Mason's Schar School of Policy and Government and Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution, I want to welcome you all to our discussion of the current state of Russia's war on Ukraine. My name is Steve Barnes, and I am the director of the program in Russian and Eurasian Studies, and I'm also a faculty member here in the Department of History and Art History, where I have specialized in research in Soviet history in particular. We come to you almost exactly 6 weeks since Russia launched a brutal and unprovoked full-scale invasion of Ukraine, expanding a war that has been ongoing since 2014. One of the best aspects, actually, of being at a research university like George Mason is being surrounded by a wide variety of specialists. We have so many people at Mason with different perspectives, different expertise that they can share on Russia's criminal invasion and war. Our program in Russian and Eurasian Studies has been working to bring you some of these perspectives, and I'm really pleased to present this particular group of scholars today. I've asked each of our speakers to tell us a bit about how their own academic specializations have helped them to try to make sense of the war. And I want to take just a couple of minutes to do that myself. We'll leave considerable time for Q&A, and you're encouraged at any time to put your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screens. I want to briefly focus as a historian on two things: the relationship between language and mass violence, and the remarkable progress to building a civic nation in Ukraine. First, I want to emphasize that historians know that language matters. Dehumanization makes the commission of unspeakable acts of brutality possible. Vladimir Putin has invented a false history that denies the very existence of the Ukrainian people as historically distinct from the Russian people, and thereby denies their right to sovereignty. He goes even further, comparing Ukrainians who want their own state to Nazis. This language has consequences. To call the enemy in this war Nazi is to justify any means to defeat the opponent. To deny the right of existence to Ukrainians is to walk a path toward mass violence. We've seen how this language is amplified, extended, and radicalized in Russian culture. Russian television beats the drums day after day, comparing Ukrainians to Nazis. And its most radical voices call for extreme measures to deal with what they call an existential threat, criticizing peace talks, calling for the killing of more and more Ukrainians. On April 3rd, an article appeared on a state-run Russian news outlet. The article was called "What Should Russia Do with Ukraine?" And the article purports, as it were, to offer a solution to the Ukrainian question. In a nasty but logical extension of Putin's assertions, it slides from denial of any separate existence for Ukrainians to a quote-unquote denazification that extends far beyond the government, far beyond radical groups, to what it calls, quote, the Nazified bulk of the population. The article declares a significant number of common people are guilty of being passive Nazis and accomplices to Nazism. It's also absurd, and yet it is used to justify invasion, violence, and what it calls in the article re-education. And let me emphasize here from my own research and writing on the Soviet Gulag that re-education is never a benign process, but one that is typically inextricably intertwined with violence. By the end of the article, we've moved from denazification to de-Ukrainianization, denying the reality of the very existence of the Ukrainian nation as what it calls, quote unquote, artificial ethnocentrism, and arguing that it is impossible for Ukraine to exist as a nation state, for this, quote, naturally leads to Nazism. Now, lest we think this particular article is an outlier, though we shouldn't forget that this appeared in an official state media outlet, we see yesterday Dmitry Medvedev, who I perhaps should call the fake former president of Russia, writes on his Telegram channel Escalate, declaring, and he writes, quote, Ukrainianism, fueled by anti-Russian poison and an all-consuming lie about its identity, is one big fake. As historians, we know that language matters. De-Ukrainianization, like such historical predecessors as de-Kulakization, contains the roots of mass violence within it, such that the horrific and grisly discoveries that we've seen from Bucha, but not only, also from Hostomel and Borodyanka and Mykolaiv, let alone what we might discover someday in Mariupol, where there are reports today, unconfirmed at this point, of mobile crematoria operating to cover up the crimes. And we don't know what is happening in areas still under Russian control. But the horrific violence in these places is not a surprise, but the outcome of language of dehumanization that starts with Vladimir Putin and moves down. It's no surprise that serious and careful scholars of genocide are starting to use that word for what Russia is perpetrating in Ukraine. And here I would just point you, by the way, yesterday there was an article in the Washington Post from Eugene Finkel that you should take a look at. Lest we make a mistake, though, that I would say as an expert really on Russian history and not Ukrainian history, lest we make a mistake that I have made, I think, at times in talking about this war of only or mostly talking about Russia, I want to call our attention to the remarkable story of Ukraine in this war. Historians are fond of pointing out that everything has a history. Most historians believe that national identity is something that is constructed at particular moments in history, rather than something that has a primordial existence. This applies to all nations, by the way. It applies every bit as much to the Russian nation as it does to the Ukrainian. The remarkable thing about this war is that it shows the way in which the Ukrainian nation has solidified around a national idea based on civic nationhood. That is one that is based not on ethnocultural or religious or linguistic criteria, but one that is based on belonging to the Ukrainian civic and political community. It is possible to be Russian Ukrainian, to be Jewish Ukrainian, to be Afro-Ukrainian. This is the idea of nation that Putin simply cannot comprehend, that Russians in Ukraine can see themselves as Ukrainian, that people can speak Russian or Ukrainian or both and see themselves as Ukrainian. This is not, by the way, to overly idealize this and to say that there are no problems of ethnic prejudice or discrimination in Ukraine. Something, by the way, that is probably more true in Russia than it is in Ukraine even. But it's to say that historians will be searching for what lay behind the development of this civic nationhood in Ukraine. The war itself has played a big role. When I used to teach Ukrainian history focused on the post-Soviet period, I would show these electoral maps with sharp regional differences in voting. But the Russian invasion in 2014 has changed those maps in fascinating ways, giving rise to a much more unified political community. The war at the moment is changing Ukraine. It's changing the civic nation of Ukrainians in fascinating ways. Many who had spoken Russian as their first language are themselves bearing the brunt of this war. And many are choosing to switch their language use from Russian to Ukrainian in protest against the claims that Putin makes upon them as somehow needing his and Russia's protection from a threat they do not feel and a threat they do not face. When Ukraine wins this war, I look forward to reading the scholarship of Ukrainian experts in Ukraine and around the world about what this has done for the building of the Ukrainian nation. So with that, let me turn to my colleagues, but before I do, let me share with you that we'll have some additional online events coming in the next few weeks, dealing with Ukrainian media, film, and history, among other things. I'll put some links into the chat for you, and you can follow the events listing on our program's website for up-to-date information on upcoming events. Additionally, for George Mason students, I want to let you know that I will be teaching a course in the fall that attempts to put the war in Ukraine into historical perspective. I'll put a link to that course description into the chat for you as well. Now let me introduce and turn to Professor Karina Korostelina. Originally from Ukraine, Professor Korostelina is director of the Peace Lab on Reconciling Conflict and Intergroup Divisions at the Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution here at George Mason. She conducts research on identity-based conflicts around the world and has a special emphasis in her work on Ukraine. Karina.
Thank you. Thank you, Stephen, for organizing this event. And indeed, it's very great to work and see my colleagues here, dear colleagues who I work with. And unfortunately, this event brings us together. And as you mentioned, each of us will pick some particular, it's a very systemic issue, but each of us will speak about several topics. I chose to speak today about two major issues: is civilian devastation and prospects for peace agreement, which coincide with peace and conflict resolution field. But just drawing on what you told as an introduction, I want to stress several points, Steve, from what you were talking about. This idea that Ukraine did choose its path. And what we see in a lot of literature, unfortunately, and I was participating in international conferences recently in different parts of the world on speaking about this Ukrainian war. And many narratives, even Western narratives, we see this idea that this is something marginalized. It's between the West and Russia, something which does not belong to one space or another space. It's, I called it wild east of democracy. When anything happened, it's a fair playground for Russia or for United States, and then we should find some ways of neutrality. In these discourses, we really see that people actually to deny Ukrainian choice, which Ukrainian people did several times. Through Orange Revolution, through Maidan, when people died, then Ukraine does want to be a part of European Union. And unfortunately, we clearly saw that European Union was not eager to include Europe in this space. There's not now even they discussing now this process of inclusion. Was not a lot of effort, not a lot of commitment from Western European countries to really help Ukraine to realize the choice they made. So this marginalized status actually really opened possibility for Putin to enter, right? And what we see now sounds really unbelievable. Nobody would believe that in 2022 we will have very barbaric war, which when one country enter sovereign territory of another country to control its government, to seize its territory, but the most important to kill its civilians. And I will mention a lot of discussions recently because of the Bucha and others happened, Mariupol, speak about civilian devastation. I want to mention 8 major sources of civilian devastation. And I will speak about them very quickly from the most immediate, the ones which come at the beginning of the war and how war processed, they become more and more developed and new forms of civilian devastation came. First reason for civilian devastation is intimidation government and force it to surrender. So for Russian government, bombing of civilians from the very beginning, Kharkiv, Kiev, was to mandate Ukrainian government and their hope was that they will surrender within several days. Second important way or reason for civilian devastation is reduced resistance of civilians. Then people see that other people are dying, in resistance of people who just put their arms and going to the fields without any preparation. So killing of the civilians also reduce the motivation or reduce even ability of civilians to be engaged. Also neutralize civilians who interfere with military operation. It's a third major reason, and we saw it's happened a lot around Kiev. Fourth issue, we see this issue related to identity, which you, Steve, stressed, because a Russian government and some military forces expected loyalty of Russian-speaking population. They expected they will be met with, it's interesting, what I see in the Russian media and reports, they do actually did believe that Russians will be happy to see them there, especially in the East and the South. And this resistance, this identity issues that are not actually welcomed, create more reasons for the civilian devastation. Fifth, we really speak, as usually, as more military operation proceed, we see civilian devastation as a byproduct of military operation, cost for military gains in a process of advances. Six, unfortunately, we see more and more reports about it. It's individual choice of soldiers and the looting. A lot of, we see reports now, confirmed, unconfirmed reports, especially in the south, but also around the Kiev. My own friends were telling me the stories that about the looting, and people were given 10 minutes to leave their house, and they were stripped down completely to be sure they're not hiding money or gold or something. And people were beaten and sent with nothing to the cold weather. It really led to a lot of sicknesses and even death. And seven, what we see now more and more, it's a result of economic and structural destruction. What we see in Mariupol, with no gas, with no heat, with no water, with no medication, people dying, numbers which they give, I don't think it's a real estimation of this 5,000 people. I think it's even more. And the eighth one, the last one, is revenge killing. What we probably see more and more, what we saw in Bucha, all these people with their hands tied down, is revenge killings, and people, civilians resist. They don't want to killing of the mayor. It's all results of this revenge killing of the soldiers, who those maybe friends were killed, or then people did not cooperate if they wanted with them. So this all reason of civilian devastation unfortunately lead to mass violence, and but unfortunately, even we accept and see the pictures for International Criminal Court, it will be a big challenge to process it and accept it as a crime. And I hope a lot of work will be done. And the last point, which I really want to stress, is the challenge for peace building process, for peace agreement. It's very hard for me, as especially a person who goes hard in Ukraine. I'm from Ukraine myself, to acknowledge, but probably the peace agreement will require some concessions, territorial concessions. And what will be the cost of the peace? What people will be ready? A lot of research on peace agreement really show they're actually inconsistent. Some research shows the more people exposed to violence, the more they're ready for peace. Other research shows the less people, the more people exposed to violence, the less they ready for peace. We also see that research will show that war and violence harden people's attitudes. They create moral boundary where concession is not even possible. We see research on sacred values, on threats to symbolic threats, identity threats, for symbolic threat as a threat to values and ideas and beliefs, and identity threats, it's threat to national integrity, national identity. All of them can actually be impediments for the peace agreement. So it's a long process, it's a very hard process, and it's not easy to speak about peace agreements at this point. So I think this session, one of the ways where we can think about it, I just wanted to stress that there are no easy answers for that. But unfortunately, I do predict that peace agreement will require some concessions, and what these concessions will be, it's very hard to accept for Ukrainian people. Thank you.
Thank you, Karina. Just a reminder that you're welcome at any time to add questions to the Q&A feature on Zoom. I would like now to introduce my colleague, Eric McGlinchey, who is Associate Professor of Government and Politics in the Schar School of Policy and Government here at Mason. He has focused and written widely about politics, governance, border disputes, Islam, and mostly focused on politics in Central Asia. He writes broadly for academic and popular audiences, including in his book, Chaos, Violence, Dynasty, Politics and Islam in Central Asia. Eric, thanks for being with us.
Thanks, Steve. Thank you for convening this. Is the volume okay on your end? Okay, great. Again, Professor Barnes asked us to look at how our own research background intersects with how we think about the war. And I have to say, unlike Karina, I am not a specialist on Ukraine, although I think this is all many of us have been reading about, listening to for gosh, I mean, since February 24th, right? So it's been very much on my mind. And one of the frames that I do use when I look at Ukraine is this frame of collective action. And I like to apply this frame of collective action to three areas. The first one, and the one that keeps me up at night and really bothers me, particularly when I think about my own colleagues in Russia, is what explains the collective inaction or the collective silence of the Russian public? So that'd be the first question I want to look at. And then this is the silence of colleagues that I've known for literally decades. So that would be the first question. The second one is, what explains the incredible collective action that we see in Ukraine, the Ukrainian resistance, this kind of David and Goliath story where the Ukrainian forces, the Ukrainian population, everyday civilians have been able to not only resist, but to push back the Russian invasion. I think if you ask many people on February 24th, where would we be today? Notwithstanding the atrocities that we're seeing, and there's no way we can, I mean, they're horrific. That said, I think many people would be surprised that Ukraine has, the people in Ukraine have so effectively pushed back much of the Russian invasion. So what explains this collective strength? And then the last question I wanted to look at is, what explains the somewhat surprising collective action among NATO member countries, among EU countries, and this united front in imposing sanctions on Russia? So three questions of collective action. I should probably start by defining what I mean by collective action. It's not what I mean, it's what we as social scientists collectively mean by collective action. And here what we mean is a pursuit of an objective, most often a public good, by groups of individuals. Again, it's a pursuit of an objective, most often a public good, by groups of individuals. Just to motivate I think an intuitive understanding, I like to use this example of a professor, a math professor, calculus professor. The professor tells his students that class can be dismissed early if 3 students come up one by one to the front of the lecture hall to solve 3 really challenging math proofs. So a large lecture hall. And while all students have an interest in being dismissed early, no single student wants to bear the cost of solving the difficult proof in front of everybody else in the classroom. So even if one student, and moreover, like even if one student were willing to solve a proof, she would know that 2 more would be necessary to go to the board in order for everybody to be dismissed. So this is kind of an intuitive sense of what we mean by a collective action problem. And so again, applying it to the 3 cases at hand, how can we understand this kind of classroom example in the context of the absence of opposition to the war in Russia, in the presence of Ukrainian resistance to the Russian aggression, and the unity with which Western powers have rallied to impose sanctions against Russia? So let me take the first one, and for me, again, the most disturbing question of all. What can collective action tell us about the silence, the collective silence of the Russian public? Now, I should note that there has been some opposition. In fact, I was listening to my colleague Nikolai Petrov from Carnegie, Moscow. I think he was being interviewed on Живой Гвоздь, the new successor to Echo Moskvy, on YouTube, and he was talking about this very candidly. So I mean, there are people who are talking about this from within Russia who are opposing. But what more broadly explains the overwhelming silence in Russia? And I think the first thing to understand is that most Russians, and we can put ourselves in most Russians' positions, I think we understand that unlike the classroom example that I started with, where it only took 3 students solving a math proof, there's no chance that only 3 protesters in Russia, or 3,000 protesters, or even 300,000 protesters would probably have an effect on the current regime. Just to give you an example, in January 2021, after the jailing of the opposition leader Alexei Navalny, we saw 40,000 people come to the streets in Moscow. We saw 10,000 people protesting in St. Petersburg, and we saw many, many more thousands protesting across 200 cities in Russia. And this large-scale opposition in January 2021 failed. And I think for a lot of Russians, the memory of this ultimately failed protest. My dogs are barking in the background. They're protesting Russia as well. But this memory of this failed protest, I think, serves as instructive for today. People are very wary of protesting because they understand that it's probably not going to have an effect. The second thing that I think we have to keep in mind in the case of this lack of opposition in Russia, lack of protest, is there are severe consequences for protesting. So today, with the new laws passed by the Russian government, you face up to a 15-year jail sentence if you speak ill of the Russian special operation. That's in citatach, right, in quotation marks, right? You can also be fined between $450 and $4,500 if you say anything negative about the Russian war in Ukraine. And on top of that, you can also be roughed up pretty badly. So one example of this is the editor from Channel 1, Maria Ovsyannikova, who held up this poster, "No War," behind the news anchor Andreeva, and she was interrogated for 14 hours following her act of protest, right? So and I guess you could say in her case, she probably got off relatively lightly because she's such a public figure. I would imagine less public figures suffer far more dire consequences. And then I guess the third thing that I would point to is how Russians themselves perceive the war. And this is actually, for me, the most disturbing of everything. I'm not quite sure how many Russians actually perceive ending the war as a public good, as something that would be desirable. Andrei Kolesnikov, another colleague of mine at the Moscow Carnegie Center, talked today in a Medusa podcast about the large number of Russians who, at least for the time being, actually support Putin and what's going on. So there's actually a fairly large portion of the Russian population, which at least in the present moment currently does support it. Now, Kolesnikov was saying that he anticipates that this support will wane over time as as Russian sons come home in body bags, if they come home at all. But for right now, the Russian government does enjoy a fair degree of support. So that's I think part of how collective action can help us understand what's going on in Russia about absence of opposition. Now, I realize I'm at 7 minutes and I've got two more things I want to talk about. First, let me just talk about the Ukrainian resistance. And here, this is a case where collective action has been incredibly successful. And I think we can explain the success by looking at how things on the ground differ vastly from what we see in Russia. So the first thing is that each individual in Ukraine, and this has been just amazing to watch, each individual perceives his or her contribution to the public good to be critical. And I think the Ukrainian leadership, and here's Zelensky, of course, but also mayors in local towns, doctors, school teachers, have been incredibly effective at conveying the message that everyone's contribution is meaningful and necessary. So, in contrast to the lecture hall scenario where I said only 3 people are necessary for everybody to dismiss early, everybody in Ukraine understands that their individual contribution is pivotal. And so that, I think, gives people a lot of agency and really inclines them to participate in what's going on. The next part about this is, the actions, collective actions. When Ukrainians engage in collective action, the public good is not something that just accrues to the whole, but also to individuals as well. So when we think about Ukrainians who are participating in the resistance, this is most of the Ukrainians who are in Ukraine today, they're defending not only Ukraine, which is the public good, the sovereignty of the country, but they're defending their hometowns. they're defending their home districts, they're defending their home streets, and in many cases, they're defending their own home. So we think of collective action as a public good, which indeed it is in the case of Ukraine, but it's also a highly individual good. By contributing to the public effort, you're also contributing to the defense of your home. And that is a fundamental difference than what we see in Russia. And then I guess the last thing that I would point to in the case of Ukraine is Ukrainians believe very deeply in the mission. Steve was talking about this in his opening comments. They are willing to pay the ultimate price for defending the nation. Ukrainians are willing to die to defend the nation, to defend their hometowns. And I don't think this is a cost analysis that even the most ardent, well, I shouldn't say that. This is not the cost analysis that I think most Russians, with a few exceptions, are ready to make at this point. Ukrainians are ready to die for their nation, and I think that is a fundamental difference. I'm going to stop here. I had a section on collective action and sanctions. I'm at 10 minutes. I'd be happy to talk about the sanctions portion in the questions and answers.
Thank you, Eric, very much. A lot certainly to think about from both of our first two speakers. I'd like to turn now to my colleague, Professor Mark Katz, who's professor of government and politics in the Schar School of Policy and Government, where he has written on Russian politics and Russian foreign policy and revolutions. He's long had a particular focus on Russian relations with the Middle East. He's written so many books, I can't even begin to name them, articles, papers on a whole variety of topics. So Mark, we're really happy to have you with us today, and I'll turn it to you.
Well, thank you so much, Steve, for arranging this. And it's my three colleagues did such a great job. This is a hard act for me to follow, three hard acts to follow. So I feel that with Professor McGlinchey's example of the three students going to the board, the three students have already gone to the board, and so I should be free. But anyway, I'll say a few words. I think that what struck me, I guess, about this incident is that, in my mind, it broke a pattern that Putin up until now has been pretty careful and cautious in terms of his use of force, and fairly successful. Now, I'm not saying that any of this is desirable or good, but his when he first became president, actually when he was prime minister, his war in Chechnya. It had been, the first Chechen war had been a disaster for Moscow, but the second one under Putin's guidance was very successful. And part of the reason why is that he was able to co-opt part of the Chechen rebellion and to outsource the war to them. But what was fascinating was that he was able to actually do this. It's a group of people who've gone to the trouble to be rebels and then to turn on their former colleagues, and undoubtedly they were at odds with. But he was able to turn that around pretty successfully. Second example, of course, was the 2008 war in Georgia. I think it was 5 days, and they seized Abkhazia, South Ossetia, and pretty much stopped there. In other words, he could have moved into all of Georgia, but he did not. In other words, that his aims were limited, and it was done very effectively. The West not able to respond effectively at all. So the war was over and done very, very quickly. Then, of course, we saw 2014 with Crimea, the little green men, moving in and seizing Crimea without much armed opposition. They were very successful very quickly, and it was really quite amazing. Eastern Ukraine, it's been more of a fight, but on the other hand, Putin has had also associates in terms of the pro-Russian secessionists. He's been able to keep this conflict fairly limited. In other words, that was sitting in part of the Donbass and was able to prevent the Ukrainians from taking it back. And then I think, truly amazingly, his intervention in Syria, where it appeared that the Assad regime, even with Iranian help, was on the rocks. Putin intervenes mainly with his air force, and through this horrific bombing campaign, they turn it around, but at very little cost in Russian lives. In other words, that here the Iranians, Hezbollah, the Syrians are undertaking the ground war, and the Russians basically are supporting this and being pretty successful at it. And so, I think that one would have expected, I think that there were those who thought that there wouldn't be a Russian intervention in Ukraine in 2022, but there were those who thought that if there was, in fact, right before the war, I actually had a guest speaker, a professor from Vladivostok, who claimed that there wasn't going to be a war, but if there was one, it would be won, very, very in a couple of days. And I think that the general expectation would be that Putin would be pretty victorious, either because he would only he would just seize the Donbass or the greater Donbass, or there was speculation, maybe a land link from Donbass to Crimea. President Biden even made the unfortunate statement that, if a Russian intervention was limited, maybe, the reaction to it could be limited as well. And even his speech on February 21st, in which he really was very clear that Ukraine was an emotional issue, he ends up by talking about the Donbass and recognizing the DNR, the LNR, and certainly Dmitry Trenin, the Carnegie Moscow Center, in his presentation, was that a webinar the next day, he said he heard the speech and thought it was going to be a major war, but then it ends up all it's going to be over is Eastern Ukraine. And then this isn't, his aims are far more limited. But then, of course, as we saw, his aims were not limited, that he called for the Ukrainian armed forces to defect, for the government to be overthrown, etc. And we have a major war. Now, sort of what accounts for this break in the pattern? One possibility is that Putin didn't realize it was going to be a break, that he believed his own propaganda about how all supposedly right-thinking Ukrainians actually were good Russian patriots, that anyone, the few who were not, were Nazis or brainwashed by the West, but that opposition wouldn't last very long. And clearly this has not been the case, and he's ended up with a major war on his hands. And certainly looking at people who do follow the military dimension, whether Michael Kaufman at CNA or Rob Lee at Foreign Policy Research Institute, this war has been very costly for the Russian armed forces, and it's not clear that they have many other resources to throw in, and much less go beyond, because certainly these draft treaties that the Russian Foreign Ministry published in December, calling not only for Ukrainian neutrality, etc., but even for NATO pulling back its positions to 1997. In other words, that he seemed to anticipate that he'd be able to reassert Russian influence not just in Ukraine, but why not into Eastern Europe? Well, obviously that hasn't worked out, and so I think that one's own earlier successes can often mislead one as to one's capacities, and I think perhaps Putin was on this occasion, he miscalculated, and this reminded me very much of the years that I was growing up when I was a student, undergraduate and graduate. It seemed, with the U.S. departure from Indochina, and then we saw the spread of Marxist revolutions, so many places with some Soviet support, whether Cuban and Vietnamese in certain places, and that the way things went was that pro-Western governments fell and pro-Soviet ones rose, and that transition was irreversible. And then they invaded Afghanistan at the end of 1979, and I fully remember that the expectation, just like the beginning of the war with Ukraine, was that, well, it'd be over and done with pretty quickly, as had been the Soviet invasion of Hungary and Czechoslovakia, that obviously the Afghans had no real capacity to resist. And the real question was, well, would they just stop at Afghanistan, or would they keep going? And there was great fear that they'd be going to the Persian Gulf and seizing the oil fields, and where would we be then? But as we saw, the Afghans did fight against Soviet occupation, and I think that what we're seeing something very similar here as well with Ukrainians. In other words, that there was just an underestimate of what would happen, and of course, blaming everything on foreign intervention, that somehow this isn't real, and now of course one can only hope that. Just as the Soviets eventually left Afghanistan, the Russians will leave Ukraine, hopefully a lot sooner than they left Afghanistan. But one of the things I think is that even though we see such tremendous, surprising Russian public support for what's going on in Ukraine, to the extent that the Russian public understands this, I think over time it's going to be hard. And I have a sense that there won't be a Russian withdrawal until we see a change of leadership in Moscow, just as it was true with regard to Afghanistan as well. One other experience I think that certainly I grew up with was the lead up to the war. What reminded me, I mean, there were so many people who, right up until the day Putin invaded Ukraine, insisted that this was not going to happen because it would be foolish for Russia to do this. It would just hurt relations, etc. I remember the summer of 1990 when people made similar arguments about Saddam Hussein, that he wouldn't invade Kuwait, no matter how much he awful things he said, because it just wouldn't be rational. It wouldn't be a sensible thing to do, and that it was clearly a negotiating tactic. He wanted concessions or what have you, and I think that there were people who wanted to think these things both then and now, because it was much more convenient to think this than the alternative, to realize what we were done with. Now, of course, Kuwait had no possibility of resistance, but Ukraine clearly does, and I think that we are in a very amazing situation in terms of just the broader geopolitics. It strikes me that one of the winners, no matter what happens in Ukraine, I think will be China, in the sense that if Russia prevailed in Ukraine, then we'd see this sort of access to the two great authoritarian great powers together. But even if Russia does not prevail, I think what it means is that Russia is increasingly dependent on China, and that China seems to be very willing to take advantage of Russia economically. I was listening to a webinar this morning about gas supplies, and that even after the 2014, when Western sanctions occurred, apparently the Chinese reached a deal with the Russians to buy gas at below what Russia could have sold it to the West for had it not seized Crimea, and that this discount might even increase, and that China is not in the least shy about pressing its advantages. So what strikes me is that Putin acted in the hope of reasserting Russia's great power position, but I think that in the long run, he's actually weakened it. This has not done Russia any favors. And I also just want to say that I believe that there is a better Russia out there, that it's not visible now. We're not seeing opposition, but I just maybe it's more a hope than anything else. But I really do think that there is a Russia that could behave decently, much like Germany after World War II or Japan, and that I only hope and pray that maybe this will hasten the day. But obviously, the Ukrainian people are suffering greatly to bring this about, and I only hope and pray that Western unity on helping Ukrainians persists and even increases, because I think that if it was not for the Ukrainians, we would be facing an even bigger problem. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Mark. So everybody can still add questions with the Q&A feature. I think maybe I want to start our Q&A session at this kind of macro level. So we have a question from Lena Napolitano. She says, why aren't our world leaders stopping Russians? I'm sure there are ways to do it to prevent more people from dying. I know there are sanctions, military and humanitarian aid. Ukrainians are dying now, and sanctions and aid take time to affect Russians. And maybe I'll throw in to the mix here a question we got from Shunji Wang, which is simply, is it possible for the conflict to escalate into the Third World War? And I wonder if any of our panelists would like to address that. I know, Eric, you were thinking about talking about sanctions a little bit, and so this would be a good time to do that. And we'll kind of start with this macro scale, and then we'll move in and look more about what's going on in Ukraine itself.
Yeah, I mean, those are both really great questions. And I think the juxtaposition helps answer part of the question, which, why aren't leaders doing more to stop this? First of all, I every morning I wake up and I ask the same question: why aren't we doing more? What more could we do? And I think this is a question that we're all asking ourselves. The second question gives us some answer, and that is, could this spill over from Ukraine? And I think this is the big concern, that if there's direct NATO-Russia confrontation, then we're looking at a potential for a much larger conflict. And there's people recently who've been pointing to the increased possibility that may actually happen, and that's just a very scary thing to think about. On the sanctions issue, I think that that point that these take time is absolutely right, and they ultimately may not be successful. So I think the sanctions are operating at two different levels, at least two different levels. One is to impose sufficient pain on Russia and the Russian economy that the better Russia that Professor Katz was talking about comes out more quickly than might otherwise would be the case. And I agree with Professor Katz. I do think there is a better Russia. And I ask myself all the time, what would I do if I were in Russia working at a state university? I mean, I would hope that I would say I would oppose it, but I've got two kids, I've got a wife, and these are very consequential decisions for people to make. So that for that better Russia to come about, there'll be a lot of suffering on the broader population. Sanctions are an effort to change the cost calculation to the point where people are willing to say, you know what, the cost of not saying something is higher than the cost of saying something. That's one way that sanctions work. The other way is simply to deprive the Kremlin of the resources it needs to wage the war. So the money, the economics, but that takes time. And there's been some studies recently that say that even if Russia can just continue exporting hydrocarbons, that's enough to carry on the war indefinitely. And we're seeing some conversation about the EU cutting back on gas, certainly cutting back on oil, now coal, but that takes a long time to come about. And then the other thing that I think we have to consider with sanctions and why they're so difficult is this has an effect not only on Russia, but it has an effect on the global economy. So there's been a lot of discussion lately about, for example, the effect that this is going to have on agriculture. There potentially can be countries where people will starve in North Africa, in places in the Middle East, Yemen, because the cost of wheat is just going to go through the roof. It already has gone through the roof, right? So agriculture is suffering. Russia's, if not I think Russia is the world's largest exporter of wheat. The other thing that's problematic is sanctions affect fertilizer, right? So Russia's the biggest producer of fertilizer that's used around the globe, there's already indications. The New York Times had a story on this morning, where Brazilian farmers are finding ways already to get around the sanctions so they can get fertilizer, so they can grow feed crops. I think there's a real fear that the longer this goes on, the less effective sanctions will be. So we're back to the question, what more can we do? And frankly, I don't know really what more we can do short of, direct engagement, which would be catastrophic. I'd be very curious to hear what my colleagues have to say about what more can be done, but because we certainly all want more to be done to bring this to an end as quickly as possible.
Would anybody else like to jump in on this question?
I would just maybe stress very important issue was, which was stressed a little bit here, a topic of world security architecture and peace architecture. What we've seen now, the institutions which has to work and have to provide security for nations like Ukraine, the situation, they didn't function. So we can expect that United Nations peacekeeping operation will be there as soon as it becomes clear that Russia is going to enter. They were not there. Moreover, United Nations actually offers exit Ukraine, exactly a situation there. The forces entered there. All international organizations were not there. UN Security Council with Russian veto on it. So there is should be very serious rethinking how we build peace architecture and how we build security architecture of the world. It clearly does not work. Exactly as Eric told, it's not working. We really have to find some other solutions for it. It's one point which I want to stress. And another very important point, speaking again about economic consequences, I just came from Lebanon and everyone is now buying their wheat and sunflower oil, because this is what comes from Ukraine for them, their major supplier. But the most important concern which I saw in the Middle Eastern discussion, and it's probably will also affect Africa, that it will be a lot of reconstruction in Ukraine. And a lot of USAID, international aid efforts now will be moved from Africa, from Middle East to Ukraine to help their post-war reconstruction. So also, because it's actually in some situation, it's a zero-sum game, right? The money will be reallocated. So it also will impact international aid. And the final position, Russia is actively destroying agricultural system in Ukraine, actively targeting fields, targeting the supply, and it will have very long effect on not just for the entire region, but exactly probably the entire world.
Mark, did you want to jump in now as well, please?
Sure. I think that my colleague said, is very important. I would hope that one of the things that the West would do, the U.S. in particular, is to attempt to mitigate some of the effects of the war on Africa and the Middle East. Wheat is something you can't just manufacture in a day in a factory, but I would hope that we could redirect some of the U.S. government, EU governments, buying agricultural produce and distributing it to places of need, because obviously this was no longer available from Ukraine. I believe the Russians have stopped exporting as well. I would hope that we would try to do this. This is a problem that Russia has caused, that Russia cannot solve, and we should do something with this. I also think that as Karina pointed out, the unfortunate design of the Security Council means that Russia can veto anything. But I think that the U.S. and the Europeans do play a role in any peace negotiations. We shouldn't let it just Ukraine have to deal with Russia on their own. One of the things that strikes me is that the West has a certain amount of leverage, and one of the things I think has to be included in any peace agreement is Russian reparations to Ukraine. And I think that there are sort of two sources. I think that we have already blocked Russian access to their reserves in the West. I think these reserves should be redirected to Ukraine. I also think that unfortunately, European petroleum imports from Russia, even if they're cut back, are going to continue. But I would think that, at least a portion of these contracts should be, in other words, that a certain percentage has to be redirected to Ukraine. Now, of course, the Russians are not going to be willing to accept this, but essentially we have to use the leverage of, unless reparations are made, no sanctions relief. In other words, that sanctions relief and reparations have to be tied together. It seems to me that's what I think we can do. That's we shouldn't leave Ukraine alone with Russia on this.
Thanks, Mark. At the same time, I think I would just jump in and add is that we can't force a settlement on Ukraine either. This has to be a decision that Ukraine makes for Ukraine. And it can't be something that's imposed, by its powerful neighbors. So we have a lot of questions coming in at this sort of global scale. I think we've touched on some of them in different kind of ways about Russia and Ukraine's position in the global economy after the war and things of this sort. What I would like to do is actually to just kind of come in one level. So we have a couple of specialists here who work a lot on regional politics. I was wondering, Eric, first, if you would be willing to tell us a little bit about what reactions to the war have been in Central Asia, because some of them have quite frankly surprised me. And I wonder sort of if you would just tell people who don't follow Central Asia closely, kind of what's been going on there and your take on reactions of people in Central Asia, but also governments in Central Asia. Thanks.
Yeah, I too have been a little bit surprised by this. I guess if for nothing other than in January, Russia, at the request of the Tokayev government in Kazakhstan, sent troops into Kazakhstan to at least nominally help put down an uprising that could have resulted in President Tokayev being ousted from power, potentially, right? So that was essentially Russia provided a backstop for Tokayev, and Tokayev was able to demonstrate that if things get worse, I've got the Kremlin backing me up. So one would think that after that intervention on the part of Moscow, that Tokayev and Kazakhstan would line up behind Moscow, and that's not been the case. In fact, it's been remarkable that the Kazakh Foreign Ministry has been fairly outspoken in its criticism. I mean, Roman Vasylenko, for example, has said that Kazakhstan needs to be on the right side of history, and the right side is with Ukraine, not with Russia. Not the exact quote, but more or less that was the gist of it, right? Another incident is that strikes me in Kazakhstan is we had this case of the Европа Plus radio announcer, ethnic Russian who lives in Kazakhstan, said that the Dядя Vova is going to come in and set things right if you oppose the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and she was immediately sanctioned by, of course, Kazakh public opinion, but also the Kazakh government, and Европа Plus, which is actually a Russian-owned entity, pulled her as well. In Kazakhstan, it's been negative. Tajikistan has actually been silent. There's really not been a lot of statements out of the Tajik government. I think when you have Russia's largest military base, if you're the host of that largest military base, you're kind of in a position where you can't come out. But there hasn't been support. I mean, there hasn't been overt support for the war, which is actually kind of interesting. Sometimes silence tells you something. Uzbekistan has been careful, but then again, at the same time, the foreign minister came out with statements against the war, against Russia. The only kind of confusing case was the case of Kyrgyzstan, where allegedly Japarov, in his first phone call conversation with Putin after the invasion, expressed support. He walked that back pretty quickly. So, across the board, there has been no single Central Asian country that has overtly supported. And then there have been cases where there's been very clear statements against. Now, in the case of Kazakhstan, and Steve, I would, of course, defer to you because you're the expert here. But I mean, Kazakhstan, of course, is worried about the Solzhenitsyn foreign policy of, northern Kazakhstan is a part of Russia, according to Solzhenitsyn, and Putin has at opportune times raised that issue, to particularly in his dealings with Nazarbayev, the former president, to kind of keep Kazakhstan in place. But there is this sensitivity that we could be next, and I think Kazakhstan doesn't want to be next and is trying to telegraph to Moscow, we're not going to be next. So there's no support, at least among the governments, and to a certain degree, it is surprising given Russia's intervention in January.
Yeah, I'm always thinking, with Kazakhstan, about Solzhenitsyn's sort of notion of what a greater Russia was supposed to look like, and that it included northern Kazakhstan. Certainly my friends from Kazakhstan, if you follow them on social media, if you either, in thinking about the events in January or what's going on now, I mean, they were incredibly upset, a lot of them, that Tokayev called in Russian troops at all in January. And they have always talked about and seen Russia as a threat to to Kazakh sovereignty. So it's definitely been very interesting what's going on there. Mark, if I could turn to you for just a minute. So in the early stage after the war began, you wrote about Middle Eastern countries and sort of their responses and especially U.S. allies in the Middle East. And I was wondering if you could just say a couple of words about that.
Right. Well, I think one of the amazing successes of Putin's diplomacy is that Putin has good relations with each and every U.S. ally in the Middle East, each and every one. And I think that, what we've seen, obviously, is that Biden has tried to, mitigate the impact on the American consumer of higher oil prices because of lesser Russian oil sales by getting Saudi Arabia and the UAE to produce more. And then the reaction has been no. They're sticking by their OPEC Plus agreement on output with Russia, and they don't seem inclined to change that. So it is really quite remarkable. These are, countries that we've provided a lot of support for, who have been fearful of Iran, and they don't seem to be willing to work with us. Now, from their point of view, I think what they feel is that we haven't given them enough support with Iran. So how can we expect them to support us on Ukraine, which isn't important to them, when we're not supporting them, on Iran? I remember going to both Riyadh and Abu Dhabi in late 2014 for conferences, and all the Westerners wanted to talk about what Putin was doing in Ukraine, and the Gulf Arabs basically said, "Don't worry about it. Worry instead about what Iran is doing to us. That's what's important." And I think that this attitude prevails. In other words, for them, Ukraine just isn't important. And I think at a popular level, there's a resentment about why is the West so concerned about the devastating impact of war on Ukraine and not at all concerned with the devastating impact of war in Yemen, for example. And then, of course, the question of the Palestinians, and one can go on and on. And then I think, perhaps, what's also, I think, amazing is the Israeli reluctance to be critical of the Russians. So their foreign minister came out and was critical, but the prime minister, not quite sure how long he'll remain. There was a defection from his coalition, I guess, just today. But they value, and I've heard, Israelis talk about how the importance of this deconfliction agreement that they have with the Russians in Syria, whereby the Russians turn a blind eye to Israel pounding Iranian and Hezbollah positions. And the truth of the matter is that Israel and our Gulf Arab allies, they fear Iran far more than they fear Russia. They don't fear Russia. They do fear Iran. And the more that the U.S. is concerned about Ukraine, this is just further evidence in their point of view that they can't rely on the U.S. and therefore they have to, in other words, if they don't work with Russia, Russia could do worse things, although I'm not sure it's in a real position to do those worse things at the moment, but of course it could be in future. But yeah, I think that the Middle East is just not as concerned about Ukraine. And there was one webinar in which a young guy, Westerner, he had been in Aden, in Yemen, and he said that a lot of Yemenis, basically accosted him. "Oh, are you Russian? We support what Putin is doing." and of course, the guy, in fact, his grandparents are actually Ukrainian, but he was saying that for a lot of Arabs, it's not, they don't see, they just don't see this as their fight. That's for sure.
So we have a lot of questions.
Steve,
Please,
if I may,
go ahead,
very,
Karina.
very,
Yes,
very
absolutely,
quickly,
absolutely.
I just want to stress that in addition what Mark was telling about the Middle East, I want to show that there are a lot of divisions within the countries which came with this war. And an unusual situation, Georgia, completely divided right now. There are a lot of conflicts around how to engage with Russia about this, but also Lebanon. In Lebanon, you have completely different opinion, and actually there is a conflict in Lebanon regarding this war, with Hezbollah completely supporting Russia and portraying Ukraine as a puppet of the West, and then it's actually punished for being playing along with the West. So there are a lot of this and I just participated in a conference of Al Jazeera Center for Studies, together in a panel with other people from India, Middle East, and China. And discussion was a little bit concerning for me because they were stressing that US is now stretched, European Union is too concerned with its own, and this is a time where China can actually expand its territory as it wishes, because there is no punishment for that. Just to show that there are very many consequences which will probably change the architecture of peace and security in the world.
Thanks, Karina. So I've attended a couple of webinars, actually, Karina, that you hosted and organized, and I know that you have for many years worked with scholars in Ukraine, practitioners, peace builders. I was wondering if you could just say a little bit about sort of your impressions of how the war has, changed your Ukrainian colleagues, your Ukrainian friends, and sort of what your reaction is to those events that you've held that have been, so interesting, talking to these people who are trying to work on these important questions.
Okay, I will try. There is somebody's cleaning behind. I don't know. Let me know if it's too sound. I can speak later. So what is important to say that, as Eric put completely right, war really mobilized Ukraine. I done research in 2014 about the resilience of Ukrainian nation for this local conflict in eastern Ukraine. And the first most important thing which came there is volunteerism. How people were able to come up and stand up. As you know, then conflict in Donbass, Donetsk started, Ukraine basically didn't have an army. It was in a very, very bad shape. And a lot of people come up, and though a lot of units organized, military units, former military people, they all come up, and this was actually saving for Ukraine, helping, because Putin was hoping to really possess much bigger territory. But the most important than volunteerism is actually happening now in all forms. As what Eric was referring as collective action, I also see this multiple very creative forms of volunteerism in different ways, and also shaping of national Ukrainian identity is very important. We really have to acknowledge, and I wrote a lot about it in my books and my articles, that it was not consistent perception of Ukraine. Identify at least 5 competing narratives what Ukraine is. And there are a lot of discussions in Ukraine also about joining European Union or still being with Russia and joining this Eurasian unit. It was unity. So it was still a lot of maybe inconsistencies how you see Ukrainian identity. Now it's completely changed. And while it's never been, Russian language never been just a major criteria for being loyal to Russia, loyal to Ukrainian, because a lot of people were speaking Russian but still had a very strong Ukrainian national identity. Now we see that people even choose not to speak. And one of my colleagues in research told that in Kharkiv now people tell them we are not Russian-speaking population, we're people who know language of the enemy. And this is very strong shift. But I also, again, I seen this shift of change in the idea of fight to the end. So this is the very hardening attitudes of Ukrainian people, standing to the very end to defend the sacred value of Ukrainian land. So we see these changes, and we'll see how, again, when we speak about conflict, we discuss the cost of the conflict and cost of the peace. So I'm extremely impressed by the strength of national identity of Ukraine. But in the same time, we see this tendency maybe not to consider different options for stopping violence in some particular way.
Thanks, Karina. So we don't have a lot of time left. I wanted to take a shot at a question here that says, what I'm struggling to understand is how can Russian military people conduct such atrocities and tortures of Ukrainian kids, women, and elderly? These Russian soldiers are people just like everyone else. They should have kindness and humanity toward others. This is obviously, a really troubling question, but it is one that scholars have tried to answer for a very long time, trying to understand how people can participate in violence, how did people participate in the Holocaust and things of this sort. So I would certainly point you toward literature, toward books like Christopher Browning's Ordinary Men, where he talks about the way in which these are basically normal people going in, and the way in which they're radicalized toward violence by the circumstances of what's going on. So you can look at something like that. Look at Omar Bartov's work on the brutal nature of the war on the Eastern Front in World War II. So there's a lot of things that one can look for scholars out there. It is, I think it's one of the questions that troubles us most often as scholars, to try to understand how people can do these kinds of things to other people.
If I may just very quickly jump in that, because it's my major topic, I wrote multiple books on killing civilians together with my colleague of Daniel Rosberg. We have at least 3 books on that. And in the other books about the collective axiology. And it's exactly right. This is the dynamics of identity-based conflict, which change perception of the people. And as Dr. Barsh told in the very beginning, this propaganda machine presenting Ukrainian as Nazi, it's process of dehumiliation of them, process devaluation and creation of moral boundary that everyone perceive as the evil, and even children and women do not have a value of life. But it's also very important that military operations completely remove first agency from civilians, but they position them as non-important, but then this actually lead into the process of complete dehumiliation, dehumanization of civilians. And also, as this conflict progressed and a lot of people killed on both sides, civilians begin to perceiving as accomplices of military, and they also become responsible perception of soldiers for their suffering of their friends. And a lot of young Russian soldiers who now in Ukraine, they didn't even know, they were not prepared for it. And I hear a lot of stories from people I trust that they apologize. Even in the beginning, they were in the first weeks of the war, they were apologetic, and they had to do something with civilians. They move people and check their cars and so on. But it's not happening anymore. You see the development, how soldiers become harder and they see civilians as the enemy.
Yeah, thanks, Karina. So we're basically running out of time. There are a lot of questions that we haven't got to. There have definitely been questions about sort of what the United States should do, and especially with respect to refugees. Somebody asks, do you think the USA should take more refugees than the 100,000 that is planned? Which immediately leads me to the response of, I'll be surprised if we ever get to the 100,000. We've made the process so difficult for people to get here. And this Gabriela Grabowska mentioned in her question about the difficulties for Ukrainians to even get into the United States to begin with. So I'd like to give each of the panelists a chance to say a last word if you would like. I'm also going to put a link in the chat. There are lots of different ways that you can try to support Ukraine. And I'm going to put in just one organization that I have personally donated to called Razom for Ukraine that has done a lot of work in Ukraine to help people. But there are lots of other sources out there, people that you can support to try to help as much as we can. But if anybody else would like to add a last word before we close, that would be great.
Well, I would just like to thank Steve Barnes and Karina and others, who have been organizing these teaching events that we've had. It reminds me of what happened here at George Mason following 9/11. We mounted similar sorts of effort as well, and then sort of attention obviously waned as interest waned, and I hope that we will keep up our focus on Ukraine, and that neither we nor our students nor others will turn away from it. In other words, that it's not normal. Just because it continues doesn't mean it's a normal thing that we don't have to pay attention to. And so I hope that we'll continue to speak out about this.
Eric or Karina, anything you'd like to add?
Yes, I put in now the event, which will be next event. It's organized together with my colleague in UK. It's on education and emergencies in Ukraine, what's happening with education. And it's interesting to perceive normalization of violence and how wars happening, and you perceive it's coming fighting all the time, but children going to school every day, universities are function. So this is a very interesting, again, part of resilience. But I want to stress two important things which is needed for Ukraine right now. It's exactly the education, peace education for children, because they have to make sense of what's going on. And unfortunately, this normalization of violence will impact their brain, and we see it in Bosnia, we see it in many places. And second important part, where I believe that from, again, conflict resolution, peace building perspective, we really need to deal with trauma healing in Ukraine, with among refugees, among people who were affected, because a lot of research shows that people who are affected by trauma, by victimizations, are not able to immediately jump back on their lives after violence finish. They're not able to engage in peace process, reconciliation process, even within the nation. So I just want to stress these two very important points.
Great, thanks. With that, I think we'll call this to an end. It's just such an honor to have these folks on the screen as my colleagues here at George Mason. And please do continue to attend events, continue to speak out, continue to try to help. That's, I think, what Mark hit on too, that we can't let interest wane just because it continues on and on. And so we'll try to do what we can as a program, and we'll continue to have these conversations. And thank you, everybody, for attending today.
Thank you for organizing it. And thank you, Eric and Mark.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good to see everyone, and thanks for the great questions.